Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We will start the program in just a minute, but I wanted to give a few housekeeping remarks before we get started. We are recording this event, and the video is going to be posted on the Basic Science website. So if you know anybody who might be interested who wasn't able to make it today, they'll be able to view this and all the videos in the series on that website. I will post the link in the chat for you as well. You can also go back and watch videos from previous seasons since we've been doing this for a while now, and there's some fascinating talks up there for you to access. Due to the large audience size, we are going to keep you muted to minimize background noise, but we would like to hear from you. So if you have questions for any of our speakers today, please post them in the chat. We'll be monitoring those and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the Interim Dean of Mathematical and Physical Sciences, Richard Allen.
Great, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Basic Science Lights the Way. I'm Richard Allen. I'm the Interim Dean of Mathematical and Physical Sciences, and I'm also a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. And I'm delighted to be here this evening to help share some of our science stories with all of you. And as you just heard, we launched this series of virtual talks last fall in the midst of the pandemic, and as a way to celebrate the breadth and the depth of the basic science discovery here at Berkeley. What we discovered is that this format is a really wonderful way for us to connect with friends and alumni around the world. So this semester, while the campus has resumed in-person education and research, I'm in my office right now, but many of you have expressed an interest in continuing these virtual conversations, and so we're happy to do that. So that's what we're doing this evening. So this series is intended to share the excitement of discovery and shine a light on the process of basic science. By basic, we don't mean simple, of course, but rather fundamental and foundational science. This is the type of curiosity-driven research that allows us to devise and revise theories and purport general truths. Well, of course, it's important that our science be used to solve problems and find therapies or cures. Without this basic research, there can be no breakthroughs or innovations that lead to applications or accolades such as Nobel Prizes, which of course we've heard about today as well. Now, Berkeley excels at basic science. Our history as a campus can be told as a series of paradigm-shifting scientific discoveries. These include the invention of the cyclotron, cancer immunotherapy, the CRISPR genome editing. Each of these discoveries transformed a field in the physical or the biological sciences, but each began with a question posed by a curious scientist. So we encourage you to post your questions as well, as you just heard Susan mention. For any of our speakers, please do that in the chat box and we will keep an eye on those. We'll answer as many of them as we can. And while we can't possibly be comprehensive in our 1 hour, we hope to inspire the curiosity and lead you to learn more at your leisure. So on to today's topic. So today we're going to focus on various aspects of climate science and how they affect our current situation here in California, droughts and fires. To give you a sense of what's coming, you're going to hear about the fluid dynamics of Earth's atmosphere as well as monsoons, biodiversity and conservation efforts, and how predictive modeling can help us understand these issues. So our moderator this evening is Inez Fung. Inez is a professor of atmospheric science in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science, and also in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management. Inez is a newly named member of PCAST, that's President Biden's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. She's also a contributing author to the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which shared a Nobel Peace Prize with Vice President Al Gore a number of years ago. Her research has revealed much of what we know about the Earth's carbon cycle, the sinks and the sources of greenhouse gas, and how climate change is reshaping it in unexpected ways. She was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2001 and to the Royal Society in London in 2019. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Inez. Oh, Inez, you're muted.
Thank you, Richard. It's such a pleasure for me to participate in today's event. Obviously, this huge issue of climate change has driven my personal research for years, and I'm happy to help showcase a few of the amazing scientists contributing to our understanding of this problem. Today is a particularly happy day. The Nobel Prize this morning was the Nobel Prize this morning was shared by two climate scientists, Suki Manabe at Princeton and Klaus Hasselmann of Germany, and the physicist Giorgio Parisi, who studies complex systems. So that's for us, is very happy, and I'm very happy for our colleagues who received the prize. So to set the scene, I want to quickly share two maps with you, one on the current drought across the US and the other on the fires. And so here we are very familiar in California with the fires. Here I just selected 31 days, and you can see the Dixie fires. And so now we have the capability using satellite to measure the fire temperature and the intensity of the fires. And obviously the fires don't happen by themselves. And this extraordinary map of drought, you can see the severity across the Western US. This is unprecedented. So 2021 has proven to be the worst fire year in recent history, and we hope we will soon experience rain. We hope to mitigate the effects of drought from the past few years. Tonight we're going to go from big to small, from the Earth's atmosphere to the inner workings of an oak tree, and then we'll learn about efforts to model biological responses of forests to climate change. I'll now ask our speakers, Bill, David, and Lara, to tell us about their research in general and their current projects more specifically. At the end of each talk, we will try to address questions from the audience, so please add questions to the chat. Our first speaker is Professor Bill Boos. Bill Boos is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science. His work centers around understanding the fluid dynamics of the Earth's atmosphere with an emphasis on the lower latitude regions. Bill, please set the stage for us for tonight's discussion by telling us about your research on storms and water vapor.
Thank you, Inez. And I'm going to share with you all a presentation now. You should be seeing my slides. And I'm going to, as Inez said, I'm going to set the stage by introducing the science that controls the water delivered to the western part of North America during our dry summer season, or maybe what we now think of a little bit more as our fire season. This map here shows the rain that falls during our summer period, and it really emphasizes how dry the western part of the US is, especially compared to this really intense band of rainfall that is near the equator, that stretches west to east for well over 10,000 kilometers. But today I want to draw your attention to this, this sort of extension of that rain band along the western coast of Mexico. It may look like a relatively minor feature, but it is over 1,000 kilometers long. And it is tremendously important for the hydrology of North America because it is not only rainfall over Western Mexico, but it's part of a pattern in which water vapor is transported into the southwest of the US, New Mexico, Arizona, and even to some degree, and at some times, California, in what we call the North American monsoon. And I became really interested in this a few years ago because I studied tropical atmospheric dynamics in general, and monsoons in particular. But I thought, you know, why does this rainfall have this particular structure? Why does it extend 1,000 kilometers? Why does it have this intensity? Why is it primarily on the western coast of Mexico and much less intense on the east. And I found that no one really had good answers to many of these questions. So I began to look at this in more detail. But I want to say a word first about the importance of these sorts of transports of tropical moisture into the California region, because we often have lightning storms when warm and humid tropical air is transported into our region. And one great example of this was a day, actually a 4-day period last summer in the height of the pandemic, when a band of tropical air got transported across the northern part of our state, and we had over 10,000 lightning strikes in a 4-day period that led to these really intense widespread wildfires that produced smoke that was intense enough, thick enough, that it turned the sky a dark orange during our normally bright daytime. This photo was taken at 9:30 a.m. right here in Berkeley on that day. And you will, though, on many other times that are maybe even a little less intense, but no less important, you'll find mention in the news of lightning and thunderstorms that are being triggered, if you will, by monsoon moisture that is coming into our state. And this sort of pattern is happening due to a particular atmospheric circulation. This is a schematic of that. And we're sort of sitting up here in California over land. Here we have the equator. This is the southern hemisphere, and this is the northern hemisphere. And there is a warm air near the equator that is buoyant and rising. As that air rises, it cools, and the water vapor in it condenses and falls out as rain. That dry air flows, the air which has been dried by losing its water vapor as rain, flows toward the pole and then sinks as it cools. And so here in California, we're sitting beneath this vast region of sinking dry air during summer, which is why our summer is so dry. But of key importance for my story that I'm going to tell you today is the fact that as air flows poleward, it actually conserves angular momentum, very similar to an ice skater sort of pulling in their arms. They're bringing their arms closer to their axis of rotation, a figure skater as they spin up in a figure skating exercise. The air is flowing closer to Earth's axis of rotation as it flows toward the pole, and that causes it to spin up. It spins faster in the same direction that the Earth is rotating, which is toward the east. And we call that air, which is spun up and moved faster toward the east, we call it the jet stream. You'll hear of the jet stream quite often if you watch a weather report. The jet stream can actually be deflected by various things, especially by mountains on the surface of the Earth. And I'll show you an example now of how the jet stream is deflected. This is a simulation, a calculation, actually, a mathematical solution of what we call the equations of motion, which are really simply equations for the conservation of energy, conservation of mass, conservation of momentum in a fluid such as air. Air is a fluid, just as water is. And we can see when we have eastward flow in a jet stream, and it encounters a mountain, that you create waves in that jet. And the colors here are colder air to the north and warmer air to the south, and the jet stream is sort of the boundary between the two. And you're creating these waves, these undulations in the jet. And these waves are very different from water waves. They are continental scale. They're the size of a continent, and they're horizontal. They're not vertical like water waves, but they are nevertheless waves in this fluid that is on this rotating planet. And so what we did is we asked the question of how do these mountains, which are outlined here on the western coast of Mexico, because that rainfall maximum I showed you on my very first slide occurs very near these mountains on Mexico's west coast that are called the Sierra Madres. And what we've done here is we've solved the equations of motion again mathematically And this is a computation you could do on your laptop. And you get this big wave pattern. You get this pattern of alternating east and west velocities. And the red regions show areas of clockwise flow. The blue shows regions of counterclockwise flow. And this is a big wave that arcs across North America, all the way across Canada and Greenland into the Atlantic Ocean. And the local part of the wave to the region that created it, to these mountains over Mexico, create what we call the North American monsoon. And this is a fairly simple calculation, but what we've done is we've repeated it on a supercomputer using thousands of processors run on a calculation that took weeks to run. And that confirmed this is a comprehensive simulation of the global atmosphere on Earth, confirmed this simple pattern I'm showing you here, but it also allowed us to simulate the rainfall that is created by this wave pattern. And we actually see here this northward extending band of rainfall over the west coast of Mexico. The magenta contour here outlines those mountains, confirming that pattern of rainfall is really generated by this atmospheric wave. And if we look down at Earth by satellite and observations, you can actually see that wave in action. This is a view of water vapor. We're actually looking down on Earth from a satellite in a band of the electromagnetic spectrum that's sensitive to water vapor. And the blue and the green regions are very high, humid, wet regions. And the orange and the red are very dry regions here over Texas. This is Mexico down here, and you can see this water vapor from this North American monsoon sort of flowing up toward Mexico, Arizona. And occasionally this even penetrates into California, producing those lightning storms that are not very desirable for us during summer. So that's all I had for you today. I just wanted to leave you with a few closing thoughts in that science, we pursue it not only because we're curious about the world around us, but because we need to understand fundamental mechanisms. You know, there is a lot of emphasis in terms of prediction and coming up with things that are useful. But if we actually want those predictions to be useful in a state that maybe we don't live in right now, for example, if global climate is evolving and we want to be able to have our physical models be useful in, say, a world that we don't live in currently, then we really need to understand how the underlying physics works. And for the atmosphere, as well as the ocean, a big part of that amounts to really understanding waves and vortices on rotating planets and how those waves and vortices are complicated due to water changing phases, due to transfer of radiation, electromagnetic radiation through the atmosphere, and so on. So I will leave you with that, and I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'll ask the first question. Was the major lightning storm you mentioned, 10,000 lightning strikes in 4 days, is that related to the monsoon dynamics you talked about just now?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So to be honest, I drew a little bit of a parallel here, and this is indeed due to tropical moisture coming up into our region. But I'm going to go to my a slide that I have here at the end. Bear with me as I'm paging through. That was actually due to tropical moisture coming up from a tropical vortex, a very transient, short-lived vortex called Tropical Storm Fausto, that created this large plume of warm and humid air that you can see here extended all the way north of San Francisco and covered the northern part of the state. Another thing we're working on in my group very actively is looking at the mechanisms by which these vortices grow and intensify, and in the sort of larger scale circulation patterns that I talked with you about earlier.
Thank you. We have a question from Warren Gish from the audience. The question is, do the Sierras also create an atmospheric wave? They just don't have as much moisture to work with?
Yep, they do. Indeed, this sort of somewhat gratuitous picture that I had on my final slide, you see these waves. The red region here is the jet stream. This is showing.
You're not sharing your screen, are you, Bill?
Oh, I'm sorry. I somehow stopped that, I guess. I did not mean to stop sharing my screen.
I can imagine what you're talking about, and it would be nice.
Yes, so this picture that I put up here at the end, this red region here is the jet stream, and you see these undulations in it. So many of these undulations are created by mountains, and the waves in the jet stream were first studied actually during winter when the jet stream is very strong. And indeed, the Sierras and the Rockies in general do create waves in the jet stream. We know those best during winter. And I think the Sierras are needed to get the jet stream far enough down to Mexico where it can actually interact with the Sierra Madres then. But that's where you have the large moisture content, and it can really start interacting with the tropical moisture and affect rainfall.
Thank you. Let's go on to David Ackley. David Ackley holds joint appointments. There are more questions. I'm sorry. I'll hold on. David, can you can you sit tightly and okay while we answer the next question for Bill. This is from Blake Edgar. Does the El Nino Southern Oscillation influence the intensity of the atmospheric wave that contacts the Sierra Madre?
Oh, that is a great question. And to be honest, that's a great question for future research. You know, I mentioned that we had to use the supercomputer with thousands of processors running for weeks to simulate this atmospheric wave. The Rockies are pretty big. The mountains over Mexico are comparatively very small. And so it's only within the past few years that we've actually had the computing power needed to be able to simulate the fine scale interaction of that atmospheric wave with those mountains over Mexico. Our global models were just not high resolution enough with the supercomputers that we had to work with 5 or 10 years ago, say. So the effect of El Nino on that particular wave, I think, is something that we really still need to explore.
Okay, we have more questions, but I have to move on. So David, you've been holding your breath. So let's go to David Ackley. David Ackley holds joint appointments as the Dean of the Rausser College of Natural Resources and as a professor of integrative biology, as well as of the Environmental Science Policy and Management Department. His research interests span climate change, impacts on biodiversity, integration of phylogenetics and ecology, and conservation biology. His research is used to inform strategies of biodiversity conservation in the face of climate change, with a focus on California parks and open space. David, please tell us about your research on oak trees and what they can teach us about the drought.
Inez, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to reach out to friends of the university. And let me just jump in here with, so this is, I love this combination of speakers because we've started at this global scale, thinking about, of course, the movement of water and the underlying physics. And now we're going to come right down to the scale of a tree. And then we're going to drill down even further to the scale of individual cells. And what's remarkable is that the fundamentals, the physical rules, and then combined with chemistry, combined with biology, work across all these scales, and our understanding is able to bridge the gaps across these scales. This is a large valley oak up in Sonoma County at a site where I work. And we take for granted, we look at an organism like that and we walk by them every day. And as a plant biologist, I can tell you that one of the joys of teaching in this area is, of course, to excite students about how absolutely amazing plants are. One of the things they do is just moving vast quantities of water while they sit there quietly and unassuming. A tree like that could easily move 200 gallons of water a day from the soil up through that trunk, out the leaves, and that's necessary for trees to grow. In order to capture carbon from the atmosphere, they inevitably lose water out of their leaves, a fundamental trade-off that plants have never fully overcome. And we also know, of course, given that they depend so intimately on that water, that they are very vulnerable in a drought. And here at another site, back in the 2016 drought, we see these beautiful stately trees, certainly 100 years old. We see trees many hundreds of years old. And then one extreme event comes along that it's just too much. After all the things they've survived, this can prove to be an event that they're not able to tolerate. So some of the research in my lab, along with colleagues, has been getting at the fundamental mechanisms of what happens inside that tree. It's something we kind of take for granted that a drought kills a plant, but how does that happen? And of course, this scales up, and we saw across the Sierra in the 2013, 14, 15 drought, more than 100 million trees, the combination of bark beetles and the drought is exacerbated by the heat and taking us into these really novel conditions, losing so much of our forests in California. What is a tree doing on the inside? I know it's late in the day for this kind of, this looks like you're back in class. And of course, this is what we share with our students. But if we look at a tree and think about it as fundamentally linking three different parts, leaves, the stem, and then the roots, and all of that water is really moved by solar energy, because as the leaves open up these small pores and they lose water, the water evaporates, that leaf dehydrates a little bit, and that dehydration creates a gradient that pulls water up through the trunk, and that pulling through the trunk pulls it from the soil, and there you get the water moving up. So just, it is remarkable that it is just passive solar energy that's able to move these vast quantities of water. And it is pulling, so water is not pushed up through a tree, it's pulled from the top. And that means the water inside is under tension, and tension is the opposite of physical pressure. So if you hold a ball and you squeeze it, that ball is under pressure. If you take a rope and you pull it, then that rope is under tension. And as that water, so the water is being pulled up as if it was just a series of little strings of water going up through these vessels. But what can happen is as it pulls harder and harder and harder in a drought, there's the negative pressures can suck air bubbles in through the vessel. And if they suck a little air bubble in through an imperfection in the vessel, that air bubble can explode inside that vessel. Now, you can hear it with a microscope. It's not an explosion like a bomb, but there's a little explosive event, and that vessel can no longer transport water. And this is something we have just developed this very fundamental understanding of in recent years about the physics of what's going on inside those vessels. So in my lab, some recent work, here we are, we start in the field collecting big stems. Oaks have very long vessels. It actually turns out technically it's really hard to do this work because you have to get a stem that's long enough that single vessels can be 1 meter or 2 meters long inside the stem. So we bring them into the lab, and here you can see they're all jammed in. They're hanging from the ceiling. They're taped to the floor to keep them from moving. And we actually put the leaf on a scanner, just literally a scanner. You could buy it Office Depot, but you tape it on there. You hold it all very still. You turn the lights off. It's a very delicate image. And then you let that plant dry out. So you simulate a drought in the lab. Here's the image, that's a leaf viewed through a scanner on the left. But as it dehydrates, vessel by vessel, you see the dehydration event. It's actually called an embolism. It's like a stroke, very different physics, but just like a stroke in a human, this is an embolism for a plant that stops the water moving. And the false color image here shows us for each vessel just how much water stress does that plant need to be under before that moment comes when it has this embolism event and is no longer functional. So the graph in the middle there, we develop a curve. because we measure tension in a plant in negative units. This is a source of endless confusion to plant physiology students every generation, myself included when I started. So 0 is a plant that's fully hydrated with a well-watered plant. As it dries out, it becomes more and more negative as those tensions inside the plant get stronger and stronger, and it loses function. So more and more vessels undergo these embolism events until you can get to 100% loss of function. In most cases, at that point, it's irreversible. So as a plant experiences a drought, first it will close these cells in the leaf to try to prevent water loss. Then it will drop leaves, just like plants in your garden will drop leaves. Again, minimizes water loss to see if they can get by. Then the vessels start to embolize. Some of that is irreversible. In some cases, even after they've lost leaves, they can resprout. Here you see a drought-stressed tree with all these little green shoots on the outside. So here's one that's coming back. But in some cases, there's a point of no return. And it's actually a runaway process when you look at the physics and the dynamics of how this happens inside the plant. So we look at oaks across America, and not surprisingly, we see that species that have evolved in wetter climates are less tolerant of this drought. Those that have evolved down here in the deserts are much more tolerant. And there's a set of trade-offs inside the plant of their ability to tolerate the drought and their ability to grow and use water and move water more efficiently through the vessels. Then we zoom into one landscape. Here we are in Sonoma County, a site I work at. This is a kind of funny looking Google Earth image looking across a very heterogeneous landscape of north and south facing slopes of different species. And we've gone in there and over many years now have set up a series of plots to do long-term studies of these forest dynamics in different parts of the landscape, thinking about long-term impacts of climate change. We've integrated that with remote sensing with colleagues at Sonoma State with a hyperspectral instrument flying over the entire forest, and we can map the location of every species across this landscape. And one of the fundamental discoveries is not a shocking one. Ecology, sometimes we do a lot of work to come up with things that people say, well, yeah, that's what I expected, but yes, but did you have the data? And one of these results is that some of these tree species here, the Oregon oak, a species adapted to cooler climates found in Northern California up to Canada. But then we find it on these more northern, cooler slopes within a landscape. And it's one of the more vulnerable ones, and one of the ones we project is more vulnerable under a changing climate. And that takes us from the fundamental science of the drought tolerance of the plants through to the sensitivity to climate. Now, as a plant dries out, as the wood gets drier, it also becomes more flammable. And this has taken us now in our current work to looking at the intersection of drought and fire, because in fact, these sites burned. And that is another talk, but I will leave it to Lara to tie together some of these questions about drought and fire that we're all thinking about together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I wish I could start all over and be a student in your lab. So what is it like to be a student in your lab? How does, do you go out to the field? Does everyone go out to the field, or do they hang out in the dark and measure leaves in the dark?
Well, unfortunately, I think we've all learned that a day in the field can be a week in the lab, either in the dark or at your computer. And I'm sad to say is I don't want to ask my students what it's like being a student in my lab now, because as dean, I don't give them quite as much time as I used to. But, no, I have everything. I have students who've done data science PhDs, where it's all about downloading public data, climate data, and tree data, and integrating it, doing big data, projections at a global scale, down to people who just very intensive day after day after day in those fieldwork settings, and including what we call pre-dawn water potentials. You have to be up before dawn to check the status of the plant in relation to the soil. The one thing that gets plant biologists up really early in the morning.
Thank you. So I have a question about, you talked about oaks, and then you showed dead pines in the mountains. So you talked about their sensitivity. So will drought and climate change impact one or the other more?
Yeah, so actually, even though we see the oaks die in the drought, they are in general more tolerant than the pines. And we can go all the way back in the fossil record during the Ice Age. When it gets colder, pines spread across California and oaks shrink in their range. And as it gets warmer, oaks expand and the pines migrate uphill. There's a wonderful pollen record at Clear Lake in Lake County showing this over 3,000 years at the end of the Ice Age. The whole landscape goes from conifers to oaks. And we're already seeing in the Sierra Nevada at the lower elevations of the ponderosa pine forest, as those pines die, as they burn, or as they age and die, the black oak are becoming more common. So we're seeing that oak to pine transition line move uphill in the Sierra already in the last 100 years.
Thomas Klein, you have your hand up and you didn't put a question in the chat. Would you like to ask your question? We can't hear you, you're muted. So maybe you can put your question in the chat?
You may be controlled.
We'll go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just I happen to be glancing to the chat and I see a comment from Warren Gish about successive droughts finally killing plants. And that's absolutely right, because one drought, the plant might lose all its leaves, but it can draw on stored reserves. So plants store carbohydrates in the roots and it might leaf back out again and recover. But now it has fewer reserves. And then another drought, there's less energy left. And, and they may not recover. And, 1 year drought, like this year was, extremely dry. But it's a 1 year drought followed by a slightly dry year last year. Once we get to 3 years and 4 years, these effects do become cumulative. And that's when we see the really big events. And if we are already going from an extreme drought in 2013 to 15 to another one in 2020 to 2022, that's just too close together. This, it's like kind of frequency and intensity that is going to have really long lasting impacts on our forests.
Well, thank you. Let's move on. Thomas Klein, please add your question to the chat and David will respond to you in the chat. Okay, so let's go to Lara. Lara Kueppers is an associate professor in the Energy and Resources Group and a faculty scientist in the Climate and Ecosystem Sciences Division at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. She uses field observations and experiments, as well as climate and biosphere models, to understand climate ecosystem interactions in forest and agro ecosystems. And very happy to report, this is a happy day for me. And Lara was just moments ago in the last hour inducted as a fellow into the California Academy of Sciences. Congratulations, Lara. So Lara, tell us about how you use predictive modeling in your research and what we're learning about fire and drought in California.
Thank you, Inez. Yeah, thanks so much. Always double tasking a bit here, or multitasking rather. So this is really fun to follow both Bill and David's talks. So my group pursues basic and applied research aimed at projecting the coupled future of climate, ecosystems, and wildfire. And we're working with collaborators at Berkeley Lab and elsewhere with support from a number of sources. So let's see if I can get, there we go. Okay, so past forest and fire management in many parts of California has left current forest with excess fuels, which by fuels, I mean combustible vegetation amounts that are really inconsistent with the fire regime that existed prior to the 20th century. At the same time, climate change, which has been lengthening the dry season and drying out these fuels more rapidly each summer, has made the situation increasingly dangerous, both for nature and for people. So these two drivers of wildfire risk, the fuels or vegetation on the one hand and climate on the other, really need to be considered together in any integrated approach to the problem. So because climate, particularly temperature and water balance, vegetation dynamics, and wildfire are inextricably linked in California, climate change is really pushing the system into new territory. So while our current predicament is pretty clear, we're living through it, it's really much harder to see where we're headed in the long term. And so it's really this question of what the longer term future holds that drives my research. The best crystal balls that we really have to see decades into the future are rigorously tested process-based simulation models, similar to the type of model that Bill was talking about earlier. So these models help us to visualize multiple California futures for our ecosystems and landscapes that are based on scenarios of change. So these models don't represent every detail of reality, but they abstract reality into the most important parts. For example, the way in which climate, carbon dioxide, and fire influence the growth and mortality of trees, or the way that high temperatures cause vegetation to use more water and that same vegetation to then dry down faster, or the way in which forests regenerate following a fire. So we're developing these models and using field data to test the capabilities of these models to simulate forest responses to drought, wildfire, and forest health treatments that we're implementing across the state to try and manage the worst effects of wildfire. So this is just a visualization of some of the output from the model that we use, which is called FATES, for a forest in the southern Sierra Nevada. And what it's showing is two types of trees that have different sensitivity to drought. So in the very same way that David was just discussing, and they also differ in their sensitivity to fire. And what these sort of model trees are doing is reestablishing in a cleared patch over a period of 100 years. So in this case, cedar is the more drought tolerant of the two, and pine is more resistant to wildfire. And each of the lollipops that you see in this movie represent a group of trees that are similar in size, that are competing with all the other trees in the forest patch for light and for water. And it's these dynamics that determine the structure of the forest in the landscape. So using this approach, which is grounded in physics and in tree physiology, as well as in ecology, we're able to reproduce field data that reveals how prolonged drought can stress even deep-rooted trees, forcing them to dramatically reduce their water use. This reduction in water use means a reduction in the growth and defenses against beetles that the trees have, which increases their risk of mortality. And our simulations also can capture reductions in the stream flow that's associated with the drought as well. In addition, we're developing projections of how future warming may reduce the moisture content of live chaparral vegetation. Chaparral being the shrublands that we see around California that are adapted to our Mediterranean climate. So this reduction in the moisture content actually increases the average number of days with high fire risk. The temperature-driven increase is offset only partially by increases in atmospheric CO2. Atmospheric CO2 actually helps plants conserve their water, because that trade-off that they make, that David was discussing, between taking in carbon dioxide and losing water is sort of helped by there being higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. But this effect is small compared to the effects of warmer temperatures when we look at fire risk in this system. So just as a final example, we're using our coupled representation in this model framework, a coupled representation of forest dynamics and fire behavior to simulate how the proportion of fire-resistant pines in the mixed conifer forest would change if fire is fully suppressed versus restored to burn primarily on the ground across the full extent of this forest type in the Sierra Nevada region. So with fire, pines are the dominant tree type across this whole domain. But when we exclude fire in our simulations, that gives the drought-tolerant cedar type an even stronger foothold over time. So we're currently testing model predictions of tree growth and mortality and predictions of fire behavior to alternate forest health treatments, including the removal of small trees and prescribed fire, which are both being used to reduce fuels in our forests. So an urgent question really facing land managers and our policymakers today is how we should manage our landscapes, current landscapes, for the future, while at the same time protecting biodiversity, limiting damage to people's health and livelihoods, and also addressing our urgent climate crisis. So by developing and testing this simulation capability that I've been talking about, we're aiming to develop an approach for probing both the past and future states of forest and fire. And more specifically, we really want to use this approach to help anticipate how vegetation and fire management that we pursue now will shape California's future ecosystems and fire risk. And I'm hopeful that these ecologically and physically robust models can help us see both the risks and the opportunities for enhancing climate resilience across the state. And I also didn't talk so much about this, but these models can also help us gain insight into how forests and other ecosystems work, especially for things that we can't measure directly in the field, but we can see their emergent effects in the ecosystem. And then last, I just wanted to mention that I also see a real need for both sustained basic research in these areas, but also rapid incorporation of new scientific insights into on-the-ground policy and decision support. And this is something that I've been increasingly engaged with as well. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Lara. I'll ask the first question. Are you talking to the managers, the land use managers, the forestry folks, the state of California, to get what you've learned out into the field, into the policy side?
Yeah, increasingly I am, and I think I'm going to be doing a lot more of it in the coming year. I've recently joined the Forest Task Force, the Science Advisory Board for the Forest Task Force in the state, and there are a lot of pressing issues around the data available to both managers and to scientists who are trying to help managers make decisions about where to implement some of these forest health treatments and how to make priorities, as well as just general issues about how to allocate essentially scarce resources and how we can accelerate the implementation of proven, essentially proven techniques for limiting fire risk, especially near where people live.
We have a question from Thomas Klein. He writes, isn't it somewhat odd that fire resistance and drought resistance don't evolve in the same direction? Fascinating question. I would think that a plant encountering drought frequency might be expected to encounter fire frequency.
Yeah, that's a great question. And they do and they don't. So trees have a lot of different strategies to essentially adapt to or manage their livelihoods within their environment. And so some trees or plants more broadly are adapted to be sensitive to fire. That is, they may have thin bark or easily burn down, but then they have a strategy to come back quickly. And so that's the case with a lot of our shrub species. The chaparral species are adapted to essentially live with fire in the sense that their above ground parts will burn in a fire, but then they will resprout rapidly from roots that are still alive in the soil. Whereas other species like the ponderosa pine will grow a thick bark that allow it to resist fire. But if a significant drought comes along, it will be more vulnerable, for example, than an oak tree to a prolonged or severe drought. So these plants, they have all kinds of strategies because they also have to, in good times, compete with their neighbors. So it's this balance between how fast can you grow in good times versus sort of limiting your liability in bad times.
It sounds like you need to model the IQ of plants. So we have a question from Doug Smith. How will the change from pine forest to cedar forest impact the animals that live in those forests?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, these species or these types that we're simulating in our models these are all trees that exist in the current ecosystem and have you know, animals and other organisms, fungi, you know, et cetera, living in association with them right now within their forest environment. And so I think the question is, to what extent are some of their animal neighbors generalists that will adapt just fine to a forest that has a different, you know, somewhat different composition versus being specialists where they need some particular, you know, some particular resource that plant provides, for example, a food source or something like that. So I have to admit, not being a zoologist, I actually don't know if there are any specialists associated with the cedar that would benefit, for example, or other pine specialists that would be harmed.
I have a question about afforestation. It's often said that planting trees, you know, to reduce the impact of climate change, reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, to help with the climate problem, that we should plant trees. You have suggestions about what species we should be planting, given that we're in California, we have fire and drought staring us down?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I think it's something that that we should be thinking pretty carefully about as we move forward to try and reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere using reforestation. As David was just saying, you know, the oaks are more drought tolerant than the pines, and we're already seeing some indication that as the climate continues to warm and dry, that there is a shift in the direction of more oaks. So for those of us who love oaks, that's a good sign. But oaks are also losing ground in certain habitats as well, where they may be at the edge of their range. So it all depends where you are.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lara, for that very enlightening presentation. We all know climate change, especially wildfires and droughts, are arguably the greatest existential threats that we have. So I have questions for all three of our speakers. Where does Berkeley research and your own research fit into the overall solution space? And how do students, undergrads and graduate students fit into your research? And me, I will turn myself around and be an undergrad. It's such a marvelous place to learn. Anyone? David, you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I'll tell you how we think about the concept on the solution side. The discussion I bring the most, especially into public engagement, is that one of the things we have to deal with is that if the world is changing, we can't simply just be afraid of all those changes. And take that pine to oak forest example as a simple one. In a lot of cases, our traditional view of conservation was, oh, we set aside this park because we love the pine forests. But what if we change our view to we've set aside a certain park because we want to have forests? They're not going to be pine forests, they'll be oak forests. But that and that's maybe a simple example, and some others can be more both emotional and more dramatic. But I think if we change our thinking some, then there's more solutions out there, because we're not going backwards. We have to be thinking proactively about the kinds of ecosystems we want in the future and how we can work with nature to guide systems in those directions. And that means letting go of some of the way, a lot of what we've tried to do in the past is just stop things from changing in conservation. And we need to embrace more of that change.
Bill or Lara?
Well, I would say that one thing that has been very fun engaging students with in this particular space, I'm leading a graduate seminar this fall focused on these kinds of natural or nature-based climate solutions, and thinking about how we consider what these solutions are and what they can offer, given the big challenge that we're facing, but also at the same time being mindful of the constraints that come into play with respect to the impact the climate is having on the landscape already. And so the students have, it's a really diverse group of students, and they have a lot of great questions, and they also have a lot of great ideas. And it's really, really exciting to sort of support them in their search for solutions, because they're going to be making a big difference when they leave Berkeley.
I would like to second the notion that studying climate doesn't necessarily just amount to figuring out how much warming is going to happen or how bad the drought will be. I think it's critical for adaptation. My group has, I mentioned, been doing work on trying to understand the fluid dynamics of vortex spin up that in the atmosphere that leads to the formation of tropical storms, typhoons, hurricanes, and we're actively working with the government of India actually to create real-time products that they can use to better forecast the formation of the vortices that produce intense rainfall over their country. And that's an example of where we're sort of doing translational research in climate, if you will. We're taking sort of fundamental fluid dynamics work and turning it into something that can be used in real-time monitoring and prediction.
Fantastic. Other comments? Any questions from the audience before we wrap up? So let's move on. To close, I'm going to hand the floor over to Mike Bachchan, the Dean of Biological Sciences. Mike is a professor of biochemistry, biophysics, and structural biology at Berkeley. He received his PhD from Berkeley in 1972 and was recruited back in 1980 to become an associate professor in molecular biology. His scholarly work at UC has included contributions to virology and to unraveling the mechanisms of DNA replication. Mike is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a fellow of the American Society for Microbiology. Mike, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Inez, and thank you, David, Bill, and Lara, for sharing a glimpse of your really important research. And I just want to say that being a dean, daily, we're so gratified to actually see the excitement that faculty bring to their curiosity-driven research. And certainly, I hope the audience today have noticed the passion and the smiles that the faculty have given us in describing their research and approaches to problems of climate change. Well, anyway, we're all struggling to find a hope in these messages. So I'm going to leave you with my own thoughts on where my hope lies. And to be brief, it's in the fantastic minds thinking about and working on this problem, including the people you have met here today on Zoom. And of course, there are incredible undergraduates, the faculty's incredible undergraduates, graduate students who study these problems and work side by side in labs and in the field with these folks on this global challenge. Basic science has always been Berkeley's greatest strengths and must remain so. Your support of and advocacy for Cal alma mater, to many of you, meant everything to us, from the incredible faculty to the postdoctoral and graduate researchers. to our undergraduates. We're extremely grateful for your continued interest in them and their work. We welcome your participation in advancing basic science at Berkeley. And I have to, of course, mention the fact that on Monday, there was a Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine to one of the alums who was a graduate student here in one of our departments. I want to thank you all for being with us and encourage you to reach out if you would like to learn more about anything we covered. There was a lot of ground covered. And if there's a topic you'd like us to explore in the future, let us know. We'll be sharing additional resources with you by email about today's topic and speakers. And a video of today's session will be available at basicscience.berkeley.edu a week from now. We look forward to seeing many of you at our next Basic Science Lights the Way event, which will be on October 3rd. Richard Allen will moderate the event because it will be about his field, earthquakes and seismology. Until then, fiat lux and go Bears.